Warning. What you are about to watch is a true story. The following program contains content that some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is strongly advised.
Confident that we are able to say that the mystery of who killed Jane Britton has finally been solved. This year, as a result of numerous forensic tests on DNA samples collected, both those collected at the time of Jane's murder and those collected more recently.
Massachusetts, 1969. The oldest cold case was just solved. After 50 years. 50 years. Say that number out loud. That's how long one family waited for a name. In January 1969, a 23-year-old Harvard graduate student was raped and beaten to death in her own bed, 2 blocks from Harvard Square. Her name was Jane Britton, and for half a century, everyone was certain they knew where the killer came from. Inside her world, her classmates, her professors, maybe even the man she loved, they were all wrong. Every single one of them. Because when DNA finally spoke in 2018, it named a man Oak. Before we climb that fire escape, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to Crime Watch Hub. We dig through case files so you don't have to. And drop your city in the comments. I want to know who's watching. All right. Cambridge, Massachusetts. Let's go. The last hours. On the evening of January 6th, Jane had dinner with classmates. A restaurant in Cambridge. Then ice skating on the common with James. They got back to her place around 10:30. James stayed about an hour. When he left at 11:30, Jane seemed fine. Nervous about the exam, sure, but fine. A few minutes later, she knocked next door. Donald and Jill Mitchell, friends close enough that Jane once played the organ at their wedding. They shared a glass of sherry, a quiet nightcap. Around 12:30 in the morning, Jane said goodnight, walked the few steps back to her own door, and no one ever saw her alive again. Now, you need to understand who Jane was, because it explains why nobody could accept a random attack. This woman was formidable, graduated with honors from Radcliffe, straight into Harvard's doctoral program, Near Eastern Archaeology, one of the toughest tracks in the university. She read multiple languages. Jane missed her doctoral exam that morning, the biggest test of her academic life. And she just didn't show up. That wasn't Jane. Not on that day. Not after everything she'd sacrificed to get there. So James knocks. Nothing. He calls out. Silence. He gets the neighbor, Donald Mitchell. Together, they push open the door. It's unlocked. And what they find inside makes no sense at all. Now, watch this. Nothing is missing. Cash sitting right there on the dresser. Jewelry untouched. Her cat wandering around like it's any other Tuesday. Books open. Papers spread out. The apartment of someone in the middle of a life. Then they see the bed. A fur coat and a rug, pulled up over a shape. Donald lifts the cover. Jane is underneath. She'd been struck in the head. Multiple times. Her skull fractured. She'd been sexually assaulted. The blood stayed almost entirely on the bed, which told the medical examiner something chilling. This happened fast. She never got a chance to run. If this case shook you, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to Crime Watch Hub and turn on notifications. Because we've got more cases that refuse to stay buried. Tell me in the comments, which theory would you have believed in 1969? The ritual or the fire escape? I'll see you in the next one. Stay sharp, stay safe. Massachusetts, 1969. The oldest cold case, just solved. After 50 years. Half a century. That's how long this file stayed open. Longer than most careers. Longer than some lifetimes. Here's what happened. January 1969. A 23-year-old Harvard graduate student, raped and beaten to death in her own bed, 2 blocks from Harvard Square. Her name was Jane Britton. And here's what makes this case different from every other cold case you've heard. For 50 years, everyone agreed on one thing. The killer came from inside Jane's world, her department, her colleagues, Maybe someone she trusted completely. Everyone was wrong, all of them, for 5 decades. And the clue that finally named her killer? Police were holding it from day one. Take a look at this for a moment. It's the afternoon of January 7th, 1969. Cambridge, Massachusetts. A young man climbs the stairs of a building at 6 University Road, 4th floor. His name is James Humphreys. He's a graduate student, and he's worried. Because that morning, Harvard held general examinations. The gate every doctoral candidate has to pass through. Jane had poured everything into this day. Years of work. All of it riding on one exam. And she never walked in. Her classmates noticed immediately. James called her apartment from the exam hall. No answer. He sat through his own test with a bad feeling growing louder by the minute. The second it ended, he went straight to her building. He knocks. Nothing. He calls her name. Silence. So he gets the neighbor, Donald Mitchell, another anthropology student, a close friend. The two men try the door. It opens. Unlocked. And they step into a scene that will confuse investigators for 50 years. Now watch this carefully, because every detail matters. Nothing is stolen. Money sitting in plain view on the dresser, untouched. Jewelry exactly where Jane left it. No forced entry anywhere, no broken lock, no shattered glass. Her cat is calm, wandering the apartment like nothing happened. Books lie open, papers spread across surfaces, art supplies on the table. The home of someone deep in the middle of a busy life. Then they see the bed, a sheepskin rug, a fur coat, pulled up and over a shape underneath. Donald lifts the cover. It's Jane. The autopsy would establish the facts. She'd been struck in the head, multiple times, with enough force to fracture her skull. The weapon was never recovered. She had also been sexually assaulted. And one more finding, maybe the most important one. The blood stayed almost entirely on the bed. Think about what that tells a medical examiner. No signs of a chase, no struggle across the room. Whatever happened, happened fast. Jane never got the chance to reach her own door. So put yourself in the investigator's shoes. A young woman killed in her bed. Nothing taken. No break-in. A killer who left the way he came. Quietly. In 1969, that scene reads one way. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong. This looked personal. This looked like someone who belonged there. And then investigators found the detail that took over the entire case. Okay, stay with me. Because this is the moment everything went sideways. Scattered across the apartment, on the walls, the floor, and across Jane's body, was a fine red powder. Not blood, powder, deliberate looking, strange, impossible to ignore. Investigators had it analyzed. The answer came back. Red ochre. Now, if you've never heard of red ochre, here's what you need to know. It's an iron-rich pigment, one of the oldest materials humans have ever used, and it shows up in ancient burial rituals, across dozens of civilizations, thousands of years of funeral rites, including ancient Persia. And here's where the trap closes. Because Jane Britton wasn't just any student. She was an archaeologist, a doctoral candidate in Near Eastern archaeology, one of Harvard's most demanding programs. And the summer before her death, she'd been on a dig, in Iran, excavating a site thousands of years old, alongside her professors, her classmates, her entire academic circle. So look at this case through 1969 eyes. A murdered archaeologist, fresh off an expedition to Persia, her body dusted with a pigment used in ancient Persian burials. Ask yourself, who even knows what red ochre means? Who understands its role in burial rites? Archaeologists. That's the list. That's the whole list. The powder wasn't just evidence anymore. It was a signature, a message. and it seemed to point at a very small circle of very brilliant people. Then a professor said it out loud. In the days after the murder, a university academic publicly suggested the powder was consistent with a Persian burial rite. That single suggestion was gasoline. The press erupted. Headlines painted a ritual killing inside Harvard. A murder committed by someone with rare, specialized knowledge. Someone from Jane's own world. And honestly, you can see why it spread. The theory needed no salesman. It sold itself. It was exotic, intelligent, sinister. It turned a crime into a mystery novel. Reporters chased it. Neighbors whispered it. Students believed it. Investigators built around it. Within days, the ritual theory wasn't one possibility among many. It was the story. The lens every piece of evidence would be forced through. The department, the dig, the people closest to Jane. That's where this case would live for 50 years. But hold that thought. Because a theory is only as good as the clue underneath it. And this clue was about to cost everyone dearly. Careers, reputations, decades. The powder told investigators exactly where to look. And that is precisely why this case took 50 years. Before we go to Chapter 2, listen for 1 second. Everything you just heard is what 1969 believed. The headlines, the ritual, the inside job. Over the next 4 chapters, we're taking it apart, piece by piece, using the district attorney's own files, the crime lab's forensic record, the actual DNA results, not the newspaper version, the evidence version. If you want the real story behind cases like this, the documents, not the rumors, subscribe to Crime Watch Hub right now, because what the evidence says happened in that apartment is nothing like what you were just told. Chapter 2. The last 12 hours of Jane's life, and the 2 witnesses nobody listened to. Rewind the clock with me. 12 hours. That's all we're going back. Because while the headlines chased ancient rituals, the actual answer was sitting in plain sight, inside one ordinary evening. So forget the theories for the next 8 minutes. We're rebuilding January 6, 1969. Hour by hour. The way a modern cold case unit would. And I promise you this, by the end of this chapter, you'll know something 1969 refused to see. Early evening, January 6th. Jane meets classmates for dinner, a restaurant in Cambridge. Nothing unusual, grad students eating together the night before the biggest exam of their lives. After dinner, she stops home briefly, changes clothes, then heads out with James. They go ice skating on Cambridge Common, a cold, clear January night in New England. The kind of evening that looks nothing like a final chapter. Around 10:30 p.m., they head back to her apartment. James comes up. They talk, mostly about tomorrow, the exam, her nerves, the stakes. At 11:30, James says goodnight and leaves. Now mark that time. Because from here, every minute counts. A few minutes after James goes, Jane knocks next door. Donald and Jill Mitchell, fellow anthropology students, and genuinely close friends. How close? Jane once played the organ at their wedding, because they asked, and because she could. The 3 of them share a glass of sherry, a quiet nightcap, completely ordinary. At 12:30 in the morning, Jane says goodnight, walks the few steps back to her own apartment. The Mitchells are the last people to ever speak with her. Now follow this closely, because this is where science enters the room. Remember that glass of sherry. It's about to become the most important drink in this entire case. During the autopsy, the medical examiner ran toxicology. Jane's blood came back negative for alcohol. 0. But her stomach still contained it. The sherry was sitting there, undigested, unabsorbed. Here's why that matters. When you drink, alcohol doesn't hit your bloodstream instantly. Your stomach has to process it first. That takes time, roughly an hour, give or take. Jane's body never finished the job, which means her body stopped before the process could. Do the math with me. She drank the sherry around midnight, said goodnight at 12:30. Blood clean, stomach not. Jane was killed shortly after walking through her own door. The forensic window is tight, somewhere between 12:30 and roughly 1:30 in the morning. That's not a guess. That's not a theory. That's chemistry. And it was available to investigators from the very first autopsy report. So the science gives us a 1-hour window. Now here's the question that should haunt this case. What was happening around that building, inside that exact window? 2 people had the answer. Witness number 1. A neighbor. That same night, they hear something outside. Footsteps. On the fire escape. Now, let's talk about that fire escape for a second. It ran up the side of 6 University Road, right past the apartment windows, including Jane's, 4th floor. And this building had a reputation. The New York Times would later describe it as run down. Poorly maintained. The locks were weak. The security practically decorative. So picture it. Metal stairs. Climbing past window after window. In a building where the windows were the easiest way in. Someone was on those stairs that night. A neighbor heard it happen. Witness number 2. Around 1:30 in the morning, the exact closing edge of our forensic window, someone sees a man outside the building, running, down the street, away from 6 University Road. The description, roughly 6 feet tall. Now stop and stack these 3 facts on top of each other. A death window ending around 1:30, footsteps on the fire escape that night, and a tall man running from the scene at 1:30. The timeline and the witnesses interlock, like gears, science on one side, human eyes and ears on the other, both telling the same story. Someone came from outside, climbed in, and ran. And this is where you need to understand who Jane Britton actually was. Not the victim from the headlines, the real person, built entirely from facts. Jane graduated with honors from Radcliffe, then earned her place in Harvard's doctoral program, Near Eastern Archaeology, a program designed to break people. She didn't break. She read multiple languages. She carried teaching duties on top of her own research. And she painted, constantly, illustrations done in her own hand, directly onto the walls of her apartment. Art supplies always out, always mid-project. Remember that detail, the painting. We're coming back to it. But here's the fact that matters most right now. Years earlier, as an undergraduate, a man attacked Jane, on Cambridge Common, the same common where she'd gone skating on her final night. She didn't freeze, she didn't run, she pulled a penknife, fought him off, cut through his clothing, and walked away. She never even filed a report. That's who lived in that 4th floor apartment. Someone who had already beaten an attacker once. Someone who knew how to fight. So what does it tell you? That this woman never made it off her own bed. It tells you the attack came with 0 warning. From someone already inside. Before she ever knew the danger existed. That fits one entry point. A window. Reached by metal stairs. In the middle of the night. Lay it all out on the table. A chemical clock, pointing to a 1-hour window. Footsteps on the fire escape. A stranger running at the window's edge. A building with security everyone knew was broken. And a capable woman given no chance to respond. Every single piece points in the same direction. Outward, away from Harvard, away from the department, toward the street. All of this evidence existed within 24 hours of the crime. None of it required modern technology, just attention. But attention was already spoken for, because a red powder was promising something far more interesting than footsteps on a fire escape. 2 witnesses pointed outside the building. So why did every detective in Massachusetts spend the next decade looking inside it? Forensic science doesn't crawl forward. It jumps. For years, nothing. Then one technique arrives, and 1,000 cold cases become solvable overnight. This chapter is about one of those jumps, and the 49-year-old sample waiting on the other side of it. Because here's what the 1969 investigators got absolutely right. Even while chasing the wrong theory, they collected biological evidence from the assault, swabs taken during the original examination, standard procedure, even then. But understand the world those investigators lived in. DNA profiling did not exist. It wouldn't be invented until the late 1980s, nearly 2 decades away. So what they held was, functionally, unreadable. A message in a language nobody on Earth could translate. They preserved it anyway, sealed it, stored it, protected the chain of custody. And that phrase matters more than you think. Chain of custody. It means every hand that touched that evidence was documented, every transfer logged, every seal accounted for. Because evidence isn't just about what you find. It's about proving nothing contaminated it, nothing replaced it, nothing broke the line between the crime scene and the courtroom. 50 years is a long chain. This one held. Whoever made that call never solved this case, but they made the solution possible. Remember that. Old-fashioned procedure, quietly saving a future it couldn't imagine. Now jump forward. Because the file didn't reopen on its own. It was pushed by people who refused to let go. First, Jane's brother, Boyd Britton. Over the years, he kept pressing for transparency, asking the questions institutions hoped would fade. Then a journalist entered the fight. She'd first heard about the case as a student, and it wouldn't let her go. She spent close to a decade digging, interviewing the people who'd lived through it, battling for access to public records. That pressure built, and built, until 2017, when formal requests landed at the Middlesex District Attorney's Office, demanding the case files be opened to the public. Here's what that triggered. Prosecutors had to review the entire file before releasing anything, which meant fresh eyes on every page, for the first time in decades. And somewhere in that review, someone asked the question this whole case had been waiting for. Earlier testing failed on these samples, but testing has changed. What happens if we try again, with everything we have now? Let's get technical for a minute, because this part deserves it. Standard DNA testing, the kind you know from every crime show, is called autosomal testing. It reads markers across your full genetic profile. Powerful stuff, when the sample is good. But Jane's samples were not good. They were from 1969, degraded by decades, partial, fragile. Autosomal testing had already been tried on them. It came back with nothing usable. Dead end. Enter the jump. A technique called Y-STR analysis. Here's how it works, in plain English. Y-star ignores most of the genome. It zeroes in on one thing, short tandem repeats, tiny repeating patterns, found only on the Y chromosome. Only males carry the Y chromosome. So the technique pulls a male-specific profile, even out of material that's old, broken down, mixed, compromised. It was engineered for exactly this nightmare scenario, evidence that ordinary testing had already given up on. In October 2017, the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab ran Jane's original swabs through Y-STR. And for the first time in 49 years, a usable male profile came out. Sit with that, a genetic fingerprint, left in that apartment in January 1969, suddenly legible, after half a century of silence. The message finally had a translator. But a profile alone is just a pattern. Patterns need something to match against. Which brings us to the second piece of machinery, CODIS. CODIS is the FBI's combined DNA index system, a national database. It holds DNA profiles from convicted offenders across the country. plus profiles from unsolved crime scenes. Its entire job is connection. Take an unknown profile from a cold case, run it against millions of known offenders, and see if anyone lights up. Understand the scale of what that means. A detective in 1969 could only compare suspects he already knew about, names in his notebook, people in his city. CODIS erased that limit. Suddenly, the suspect pool was the entire National Offender Database, including people no investigator had ever heard of, including people who were no longer alive. Because here's a detail most viewers never consider. When an offender dies, their profile doesn't leave the system. It stays, searchable, forever. Investigators entered the 1969 profile into the system. Then they waited. Months passed. And in July 2018, the machine answered. A match. Against a profile already sitting in the database. A convicted offender. On file with the Massachusetts State Police. Half a century of theories. Grand juries. Ruined reputations. Inherited warnings. And the answer surfaces from a database query. Here's the name. Michael Sumter. Say it back to yourself. Because you've heard 50 years of this case now, and that name has appeared nowhere. Not a student, not a professor, not the boyfriend, not the advisor, not one person from the department, not one name from a single theory. In 5 decades of theories. A complete stranger to every story ever told about this case. The inside job? There was never an inside job. The specialized knowledge never existed. The entire framework this investigation lived inside was wrong from the opening week. Michael Sumter, a name from outside the walls, exactly where the fire escape had been pointing all along. Hold on, pause the story right here, because this is the moment that separates Crime Watch Hub from every channel that just reads headlines. Anyone can tell you who did it. We just showed you how they found him, the lab technique, the database, the mechanics, and the next chapter contains the method that changed cold cases in this country forever, the confirmation technique that's closing decades-old files right now. As you watch this, subscribe to this channel right now, because when the next 50-year-old case cracks open, we'll break down exactly how it happened, the day it happens, and you'll understand it better than the reporters covering it. Okay, back to July 2018. Because there's a problem. A database match is a lead, not a verdict. And Michael Sumter had been dead for 17 years. To prove it, investigators needed DNA from a man they couldn't test, and they found it somewhere nobody expected. How do you test a man who's been dead 17 years? That's not a riddle. That was the actual problem on investigators' desks in July 2018. Because the database result they'd received was what analysts call a soft hit. Let me define that precisely. A soft hit identifies a candidate. It says, this person is very likely your match. But candidate level is not courtroom level. Not for a case this old. Not for an announcement this big. To close the oldest file in the county, they needed confirmation, direct comparison, fresh DNA, from a man who no longer existed. Here's the workaround. And it's brilliant. Think back to how Y-SAD works. It reads only the Y chromosome. And the Y chromosome does something unique. It passes from father to son, virtually unchanged, generation after generation. Which means every male in the same paternal line carries essentially the same Y profile. A father, his sons, their sons, one genetic signature, running down the family tree. So investigators didn't need Michael Sumter. They needed any male relative from his father's line. His records showed a biological brother. But by the mid-2010s, nobody knew where he was. So how did they find him? Ancestry.com. the same genealogy website millions of people use to build family trees. Investigators used it to trace the family and locate the brother. He agreed. Voluntarily. Gave a sample. The lab compared his Y profile against the 1969 evidence. The result excluded 99.92% of the male population as the possible contributor. And one more critical step. The brother himself was tested and excluded. It wasn't him. Couldn't be him. Which left exactly one man in that paternal line. The DNA on Jane Britton's bed belonged to Michael Sumter. It had been there since January 7, 1969. So who was he? Read his record. It answers everything. Michael Sumter was a career criminal. His adult file stretched back decades. In 1975, he was convicted of attacking a stranger, a woman, in her own Boston apartment. He got 15 to 20 years. Even that sentence didn't stop him. In 1985, while out on a work release program, he attacked another woman. That crime sat unsolved for 20 years, until CODIS matched it to him in 2005. Notice the date, 2005, after his death. Because Michael Sumter died of cancer in 2001, age 54. And that became the pattern of his entire legacy. The system kept matching him to crimes after he was gone. The final posthumous count, 5 sexual assaults, 3 murders, all confirmed through DNA. And he was never tried for a single killing. Not one courtroom, not one verdict, not one victim's family facing him. He simply ran out the clock. Now look at the other 2 names. Because Jane wasn't an anomaly. She was the beginning of a pattern. Ellen Rutchick, 23 years old, the same age as Jane. Killed in her Beacon Street apartment in Boston, 1972. Her case sat unsolved for decades, until CODIS matched Sumter in 2010. Mary Lee McLean, 24. Killed in her Mount Vernon Street apartment, 1973. Matched to Sumter in 2012. And the McLean case carries a detail you need to hear. He entered through the fire escape, while other people were home, in that same apartment. Nobody heard enough to stop it. Study the pattern. Young women, alone in their bedrooms, at night, reach through windows and fire escapes, attacked with no warning, gone before anyone understood what the sounds were. 3 cities worth of addresses. One method. One man. And now, every loop in this story closes. Chapter 1 told you the killer seemed like someone who belonged. Here's why the scene read that way. Sumter had grown up partly in Cambridge, attended first grade in the city's public schools, had juvenile arrests on record with Cambridge police. He didn't know Jane. He knew the territory, which buildings were old, which windows sat beside metal stairs, which locks were a formality. Chapter 2 gave you a running man, roughly 6 feet tall, fleeing at 1:30 in the morning. Michael Sumter stood 5'11". And that neighbor who heard footsteps on the fire escape. They weren't imagining anything. They were listening to the crime itself. In real time. Both witnesses were right. On night 1. About everything. The evidence never failed this case. The interpretation did. November 20th, 2018. 2 months before the 50th anniversary of Jane's death. Middlesex District Attorney Marian Ryan steps to a podium and announces that the mystery is solved. The case, officially closed. The oldest cold case her office had ever resolved. And the red ochre? The clue that hijacked half a century? The DA's office called it a red herring, unrelated to the crime. 1 sentence. That's all it took to bury 50 years of theories. But the announcement did something bigger than name a killer. It formally lifted the cloud off the innocent. The advisor. 4 decades as the case's favorite suspect. Cleared by science. Publicly. Permanently. James Humphreys. The man who lost his Harvard future to whispers. Cleared. Lee Parsons. Gone since 1996. His memory, finally free of it. And Donald Mitchell, the friend who found her. He'd spent 50 years convinced the answer lived inside Jane's academic circle. When investigators told him the truth, he admitted his surprise. Almost nobody back then believed a stranger did this. He'd carried the wrong story for half a century, through no fault of his own. The story was simply that powerful. Jane's parents didn't live to hear the name. They died with the question still open. Her brother Boyd did live to hear it. A reverend by then, in California. He thanked the journalists and investigators who never let the case die. And he said something worth sitting with. Half a century of mystery and speculation had clouded the crime that shattered Jane's life. And their family. The DNA might be all the conclusion they'd ever get. And learning to understand and forgive remained a challenge. No anger. No victory lap. Just honesty. After 50 years of waiting. Here's where this case leaves us. The truth was never hiding in Harvard's hallways. It was never buried in academic rivalries, or ancient rituals, or any of the brilliant theories. It came up a fire escape nobody sealed, through a window in a building with documented security failures, carried by a stranger who never knew his victim's name. And it was proven by a swab collected in 1969, a technique invented decades later, and one cheek sample from a brother found on a genealogy website. That's the full machine. Preservation, persistence, science. 50 years of asking, ended by people who refuse to stop. Cases exactly like this one are cracking open right now. YSTR, familial DNA. Genealogy databases. The same tools you just watched close a 50-year file are working through evidence lockers across the country tonight. Crime Watch Hub is already deep in the files of the next one. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're in the room when the next name gets read.